Across the US, tribal ancestral lands and treaty rights are feeling the pressure of a growing love for the outdoors. More and more people are heading out to hike, fish, paddle, and explore public lands and waters. And while that enthusiasm is easy to celebrate, it also has real impacts. In Washington, the Tulalip tribes and Snoqualmie tribe have both pursued initiatives to bring awareness to these concerns. At the same time, Washington state government is working alongside tribal nations to co-develop new approaches to recreation management, building tools and a shared framework for stewardship. The goal? To better care for natural and cultural resources, and to ensure that protected tribal rights on state lands are not just acknowledged, but upheld. Today, we're diving into what that collaboration looks like, and why it's so important for the future of these lands we all care about.
Welcome back to Season 2 of Trailbreak Radio, the Winter Wildlands Alliance podcast. I'm Emily Scott.
And I'm Anneka Williams.
This season is an 8-part series featuring recorded conversations from Winter Wildlands Alliance's 11th Biennial Grassroots Advocacy Conference, held last September at the University of Washington's Pack Forest near Mount Rainier.
Thanks to our conference sponsors, we're able to share these conversations beyond the room.
In today's episode, we're talking about a tension we're all navigating: access and adventure, and the responsibility that comes with both.
Participation in outdoor recreation on public lands and waters is increasing, and with that growth comes real impacts to tribal ancestral lands, treaty rights, as well as wildlife and natural ecosystems.
In response, in Washington state, the Tulalip tribes and Snoqualmie tribe have both pursued initiatives to bring awareness to these concerns. Additionally, the state is working with tribes to co-develop recreation management tools and a framework to coordinate cooperative stewardship of natural and cultural resources and preserve protected tribal rights on state lands.
We are joined by Libby Nelson, a senior environmental policy analyst for the Tulalip tribes, Sarah Ballew, governmental affairs program manager for the Snoqualmie tribe, Ezekiel Rohloff, the wildlife program manager for the Snoqualmie tribe, Joel Sisolak from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Betsy Robblee from the Mountaineers to explore collaborative efforts to address recreation impacts and management strategies with tribes.
The Washington case studies you'll hear in this conversation are eye-opening and practical. They ask for a mindset shift.
Away from public lands as just playgrounds,
and towards relationship, reciprocity, and shared responsibility, especially as winter recreation grows.
With that, let's dive in. Listen together while you're driving to the trailhead, making a cup of coffee, or walking the dog, and tune in for more conversations to come.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Betsy Robblee. I'm the Conservation and Advocacy Director with the Mountaineers, and I have the honor of moderating this panel on Indigenous leadership in public land stewardship. How many folks here are from Washington State? Cool. Yeah, all of these folks too. So if you don't live in Washington, you might not know that Washington State is relatively unique in that it has 29 federally recognized tribes. So the next slide, we have a map of tribes in Washington. So many tribes are treaty tribes with reserved rights to hunt and gather on open and unclaimed lands, including state and federal public lands. Others have protected tribal rights to these natural and cultural resources. And tribes in Washington are very active participants in environmental stewardship and work to address issues like climate change, habitat restoration, protection, cultural resources, treaty-protected resources, and many more. So just like in many other places around the country, outdoor recreation on public lands in Washington is growing rapidly with an expanding population. And with the growth in outdoor recreation, many Washington tribes have been increasingly concerned about recreation's impact on the environment, particularly what it means for tribes to exercise their tribal rights and cultural practices. And many of us in the conservation and recreation community share similar concerns about recreation's impact on the environment and the need to more sustainably manage our public lands. So in my role with the Mountaineers and the Outdoor Alliance Washington Network, we've been starting to engage more deeply with tribes like those with us today to better understand their concerns and find common ground and opportunities for partnership. So it's been an honor through this work to get to know Libby and Sarah and Ezekiel. And I'm really honored that and grateful that they've agreed to join us today to share their perspectives and help us all better understand the impact of recreation and how we can help as individuals, as nonprofits, and government agencies. And speaking of government agencies, we have Joel Sisolak from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife with us. The Washington State Land Management Agencies, including WDFW, have been working collaboratively with tribes to address recreation impacts and management strategies on state lands. And this process, in my opinion, is truly groundbreaking, and I'm excited for Joel and the other panelists to share a little bit more about it. So without further ado, let's have the panelists introduce themselves, and let's start with Ezekiel.
Hello, thanks for having me, everyone. My name is Ezekiel Rohloff. I'm a tribal employee, not tribal member. I am the wildlife program manager for the Snoqualmie tribe and have been crossing some bridges to do some recreation impact work on wildlife as well.
Thanks. I'm Libby Nelson, Senior Environmental Policy Analyst with the Treaty Rights Office of the Tulalip Tribes, which is a part of their Natural and Cultural Resources Department. And I've been at it since we were about a dozen full-time employees, and now we're at over 120. So it's been a lot of years, and many grants later that have built the program. And I want to thank Betsy for convening and suggesting this panel. I really appreciate you kind of honoring tribes in their role in stewardship of public lands, and thank Wildlands Alliance, because this report in particular was pretty awesome, and I really appreciate it when you looked at environmental impacts of recreation and winter wildlands. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Ballew. I'm the External Affairs Program Manager with the Snoqualmie Indian Tribe. I'm a citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Nation in Michigan, and I've been with the tribe almost 2 years now, and I support the Snoqualmie tribe's ancestral lands movement.
Hi, everyone. Joel Sisolak. I'm a planner with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I don't know if anyone else caught it, but Betsy said she was honored to be here with Ezekiel, Libby, and Sarah. And I just want to say that I'm honored to be here with all four of these folks.
Called out.
So Department of Fish and Wildlife, we manage about 1 million acres of land across Washington state. A lot of the lands we manage are in the eastern part of the state, but we also manage a lot of water access areas, about 450 or so, and many of those are in the western part of the state. So happy to be here. Thanks.
So honored to have you here, Joel.
Likewise, Betsy.
All right, so we're going to start with Libby. Libby, the Tulalip tribes have been really a leader in raising awareness about the impact of recreation on treaty rights, wildlife. Can you share a little bit more about the tribe's perspective on recreation impacts, and also a little bit about the report that you released in 2021? And we have the next slide is a QR code, not a pretty picture, but a QR code for that report if you want to grab that.
Thanks, Betsy. So let me back up one moment and just tell you briefly who the Tulalip tribes are. They are a group of tribes and allied bands that were signatory to the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott, where they collectively ceded millions of acres of land, many of which are the public lands we're talking about in Western Washington today, but retained or reserved really important rights to continue their lifeways. And that, in legal language, was to continue fishing in usual and accustomed areas, and to hunt and gather on open and unclaimed lands. And public lands are largely considered to be open and unclaimed lands for treaty purposes, so it kind of explains why the tribes have a very profound interest in how these lands are managed, and if those resources that they depend on for exercising their treaty rights, as well as their access to them, is protected by the federal or state land managers who are managing them, and hopefully managing them closely with their tribal partners. Really, until a little over a decade ago, recreation was something that was not on our radar. And it really was with the population of Western Washington growing gangbusters over that period of time, and with it, kind of the associated interest in recreation. In fact, it was kind of a draw. I mean, it was a very big draw, and businesses, the tech companies, used it to draw people. They call it the second paycheck sometimes, was that access to those public lands. So tribes who have they can't move out of the area. Those are the lands that they are their ancestral lands and where their rights are based. Started hearing from tribal members, tribal hunters, other people out on the land gathering things, that they were that the areas that they were going to were becoming more crowded, and in some cases that crowding equated to scaring off wildlife, so that it was displacing them from some of the areas that they had traditionally hunted. One of them was the Middle Fork Snoqualmie, where my boss, Jason Gobin, spent much of his teen years with his family hunting that he doesn't go to anymore. So we started hearing about that. I became really curious and pulled in somebody from our wildlife program just to look at what is the literature, what's the research say about recreation impacts, its impacts on wildlife, aquatics, et cetera. And that is when that culminated, and this was during COVID, kind of early part of COVID, that we published a literature review called The Recreation Boom on Public Lands in Western Washington, Impacts to Wildlife and Implications for Treaty Tribes. And that really served as a basis for our advocacy in continuing to try to draw attention to our public land managers that this is creeping up. In fact, some people call it a runaway train, like Tino, that's his characterization, in that, like any other land use, it's really important that we understand it, understand these trends, understand their collective or cumulative impacts, and come up with some thoughtful, creative ways of tweaking how we manage recreation to account for those impacts and do it better. And we've always at Tulalip said this should be not a tribal issue. This should concern everybody, and I'm sure it does. I'm sure you see it in terms of crowding in certain places and what those impacts are. But often the impacts that you don't see are the most significant ones. It's not the leave no trace. It's the fact that your presence in an area may be scaring off wildlife. It may have other kind of ramifications that you can't see with the naked eye, but that has the impact of kind of fragmenting this habitat. So our literature review focused on wildlife. There are, there's room for another report like this on aquatic environments. But it did become a good base from which we could do our advocacy. So what we did, we also reached out to other tribes in our area, and we began to meet as a group of tribes and realized that all tribes were seeing the same thing and had the same concerns. That culminated in a letter to the governor and a letter to federal agency heads to sit down and dialogue with tribes about recreation and look at ways that we could come together and work towards solutions. And we know that without the without the user community, we will not be successful. So we are looking for opportunities to connect, and we have already with NGOs. We're working with Betsy, who's been taking this message back, and many others. And hopefully we will come up with some very good solutions to just improve on how we are managing recreation. And I think you'll hear about some of that later in the next panel. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Libby. So Sarah, the Snoqualmie tribe, I think, has done just a tremendous job of educating the general public about recreation impacts through the Snoqualmie Tribe Ancestral Lands Project. And we have the next QR code is for accessing those resources. Can you share a little bit about, Libby shared about the Tulalip's perspective, but share about Snoqualmie's perspective on recreation impacts and a little bit about the work that you're doing through the Ancestral Lands Project?
Yeah, thanks, Betsy. So the Snoqualmie tribe, the heartland being around Snoqualmie Falls, one of the most sacred sites, the sacred site for the Snoqualmie tribe, and that I-90 corridor. This movement, this education initiative, really launched in COVID. So along with the boom in recreation, as kind of Libby explained, that I-90 corridor just saw such an increase in recreation that the tribal members similarly were out gathering, are being pushed out of these areas, some of their cultural areas that have been known for generations. And while though the apathy was what was concerning to the tribe of being able to explain the perspective of, losing that access and not having the general public even be aware of the Snoqualmie tribe, with many of the sites carrying the Snoqualmie name. That really launched a public education initiative to, one, educate visitors of the Snoqualmie tribe, Snoqualmie people that are visiting Snoqualmie Falls, Rattlesnake. There are so many very popular recreation areas along the I-90 corridor, all the way to Snoqualmie Pass, that the tribe's really encouraging a mindset shift, right? As you come to these lands, it's more than just the human-focused experience of, I really want to go to this trailhead. How fast am I going to, make it to the top? So encouraging people to, one, learn about the indigenous folks of the land, the indigenous people and their connection to the land, the wildlife, the plant life that are native to these areas, to invite people to be a part of something that's kind of larger than that one hike, that one bike ride, to really enrich the experience and kind of stop impacts before they happen. Because we were seeing that trash collect at trailheads. We were seeing the wildlife impacts. And we just really want to give inviting ways to kind of think about the experience as something that's larger than a human-centric experience. And then give fun ways to kind of connect to the land. So everything from native plant coloring books to, hey, be a part of the data collection and monitoring of these places that, are kind of being overloved. So the Snoqualmie tribe works with land managers, including Mount Baker, Snoqualmie National Forest, DNR, state parks, others, to kind of share that data and monitoring of the visitors. Are you seeing trash? Are you seeing instances of conflicts with wildlife when you're out there? What's hindering you from taking out other people's trash when you visit places? So we learned a lot from just these public observations, inviting the public to be a part of creating that solution in partnership and really following, the tribe's perspective of, hey, this is something where we can all be more mindful, and here's the different ways you can be mindful. And we can all be a part of a solution so that, right, it goes beyond leave no trace. It's actually acknowledging the traces we do leave and trying to better the lands and better the relationship that we all have with these places that we like to visit. So that's where the Ancestral Lands movement now, through partnership building, through Trailhead Ambassador programs, really centering an experience outside of just what can we as humans kind of get out of a place. What are now known as public lands, really built from a conquest culture. What can we re-envision as we experience these lands? And so through our social media, through our different interactive tabling booths and partnerships with search and rescue and wildlife ambassador programs, love hearing from the public and love just co-creating, how can we all be better in better relationship. So we're really excited to keep continuing and strengthening those relationships, inviting the public to share what you're seeing out there, and being, part of the volunteerism that right now is really important.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Ezekiel, so you're the wildlife biologist for the tribe, and with your role, you get an on-the-ground perspectives about the impacts of outdoor recreation on wildlife. We were just talking about some of the field surveys that you've been doing this summer. So can you share a little bit more about your work and particularly what we see with winter recreation and the impacts on wildlife?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Betsy. What a wonderful discussion that we're having. I'm really thankful to be a part of this. I'm just over here nodding my head in agreement with my wonderful colleagues over here. This is really important information to get across. And a little bit more background about myself. I'm the wildlife program manager for the tribe, but I'm also a resident on the I-90 corridor. So I do consider myself part of the problem. And as I've worked into this job, I've honestly made some changes to the way that I recreate on the landscape. Changed my perspective quite a bit, and it's been very rewarding. STOLM has been a big part of that, the Snoqualmie Tribe Ancestral Movement, or Ancestral Lands Movement. What I see on the ground is a lot of what's already been covered, is displacement of wildlife. And winter recreation might look different in Western Washington. I mean, the biking is a great winter activity because all of the vegetation is out of your way and you're not bushwhacking through. So specifically with biking, we see a pretty significant disturbance of our elk population in the valley. A fast-moving, quiet recreator moving through the woods is sure to trigger a fight or flight response from these ungulates. And with emerging technologies, GPS, better gear, better equipment, more connection to the outdoors, huts connected through the mountains, more and more people are moving more regularly and further into the backcountry in these delicate times in winter. And that's a very sensitive time, and I think Libby mentioned it earlier. It's the impacts are not realized by the recreator themselves. These impacts are felt months later by these critters when they exert themselves and spark this fight or flight response in a delicate time. It's often not realized until the spring, and I don't know why I'm getting a little choked up. What's going on? Are you okay? But not to beat a dead hiker. Can I say that? Okay. Yeah. I think you know what I mean. But the trash is what is the observed impact. And I shall share a little story. My brother got caught smoking because he was smoking during the winter, and he flicked all of his cigarette butts out the back door. Springtime, you see the pileup of trash. And in our ski areas, our parking lots, there's a huge deposit of trash all over the mountain underneath the lift lines, and that is the realized impact that we see during these times. What we can observe as recreators, but the wildlife often see these impacts. They go unnoticed. And one thing we've been working on is a little bit more of a deeper look into some of the lesser known critters. A big goal of the wildlife program for the Snoqualmie tribe has been to keep common things common, and all of the megafauna, the charismatic megafauna that we all love, rely and depend on rodents and all of these very delicate ecosystem structures. And something I really enjoy talking about is subnivean tunnels, and all that means is just tunnels underneath the snowpack. And with recreation in all forms, expanding further and more often into winter. These very delicate subnivean tunnels are disrupted, and I don't want to take too much of that. I'm sure someone else is going to talk hopefully more about those, but we in the wildlife team at the Snoqualmie tribe just work to bring awareness. It's worked for me. I've made significant changes to the way I recreate, and one of the biggest things I like to share with folks is if you're in the woods recreating, I get a lot of complaints like, I can't find the wildlife, I don't see anything. Well, it might be the way that you're recreating. They might be there, you just might be disrupting them.
Thanks, Ezekiel. I think we all get a little choked up when we think about baby wildlife, baby critters. Joel, Libby talked a little bit about the work that tribes are doing with state land managers, but could you share a little bit more about kind of that work to work together to address shared concerns about recreation impacts between tribes and land managers?
Sure. Thanks. I just want to say before I forget, I'm not a biologist. So I've been doing a lot of on-the-job learning. I'm a planner. But I only, like last year when I was working on, actually this is now several years ago, I was working on the recreation strategy for the department, and I learned about subnivean tunnels, and it just sort of blew my mind. I don't know why. Anyway, silly little side story. So the work we're doing, DFW, and I'm only one person even on this panel that's working with that initiative. It's called the State Tribal Recreation Impact Initiative, and it's in its third or fourth year? Third year? Yeah, third year. We work with, there are 31 tribes actually that are working on that. There are the 29 tribes based in the state, and then 3 other tribes that also have rights in the state, along with my department, which is Fish and Wildlife, Department of Natural Resources, State Parks, the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs, and the Recreation and Conservation Office. So it's a lot of people. It's a lot of governments coming together, creating in a way a new bureaucracy. But it's been super exciting. The vision, which we worked out really early, I'm going to read it because there was a lot of wordsmithing that went into it. Tribes and state agencies working together to co-develop recreation management tools and an adaptive management framework that effectively coordinates cooperative stewardship of natural and cultural resources and preserves protected tribal rights on state lands. So that's quite a mouthful, but I think some of the words to highlight there are cooperative. And one thing about this effort that I would also say is, it's a convergence of shared interest and shared concern by the state agencies with tribes. I think we've all seen the recreation boom. When I was working on our recreation strategy, I referenced the recreation boom. It's a really good piece of work. I do encourage you to check it out. Coming out of COVID, all state lands were pretty hammered. They're pretty hammered during COVID. And it's really, it's not like an anomaly. The use and impact has steadily grown. It tapered off maybe a little bit after COVID, but it's still continuing on an upward trajectory. So the STRI initiative is coming out of that. Some of the desired outcomes, we have a shared interest in improving the condition and protection of natural and cultural resources. We want to protect tribal rights and interests. And then also this one, we want to continue to provide high quality, sustainable recreation opportunities. So the Department of Fish and Wildlife, like all the state agencies, has a dual mission where, we're primarily focused on conservation, but we also are committed to providing public access to state lands. So how we cooperate and collaborate to do that sustainably. Just briefly how we're organized. Like I said, we did kind of create a new bureaucracy of bureaucracies. So we have various levels of leadership. We have a leadership assembly, which is made up of the governor, governor's office, the commissioner for public land, which is also an elected position in Washington, state agency directors, and then tribal councils. And then we have a steering committee, working groups, and something that's also worked really well is we have state and tribal caucuses where we work together within our caucus. Sometimes we have to step back from the initiative, kind of collect our thoughts, and go back in. And just as a side note, I think the state caucus has been an incredible benefit, not just for this initiative, but for the state agencies. Because one of the things that, we, Department of Fish and Wildlife works with tribes a lot on a lot of different things, and we're doing a lot of plans, we're doing a lot of projects and rules, et cetera, and we're committed by both law and policy to engage with tribes on all of that. And that's important, but also part of the challenge, that all the state agencies are engaging with all the tribes all the time in a lot of different ways. So one of the reasons why STRI came about is we were hearing from tribes, you all need to get your shit together and talk to us as a unit, because we're it's like a death by 1,000 cuts. So one of the advantages for us too is we're coordinating with state partners in a way and in a depth that we haven't before. So that has a kind of an add-on benefit, I think, both for the people of the state, for the state agencies, and hopefully for state lands. So.
Great. Before we move to our next round of questions, Libby or Sarah, anything you want to share about STRI from tribe's perspective?
Yeah, I co-lead with the state the technical committee, which is part of the bureaucracy, and has kind of taken over my life. Maybe Joel's too. Was kind of unexpected, but a good problem to have. And what we've been working really for the last 2 years on is kind of developing that framework that Joel referenced, which is, how do you account for those impacts, and how do you integrate it into some kind of a consistent and uniform system. So kind of something that the state agencies will do when they're imagining new recreation, or when they are planning for around their existing recreation. How might we make that more ecologically friendly? That will go 90% of the way in supporting tribal treaty rights. And also, some of these crowded areas and cultural sites that Sarah mentioned. Also, what does access look like for tribes to those kind of areas as well? So.
Today's episode is brought to you by Mountain Training Center, an online platform for avalanche education and mountain training built by guides and instructors who want learning to actually stick. Their solution? Online courses you can take at your own pace and revisit all season. From avalanche awareness and rescue fundamentals to mapping, mobility, and training plans for ski touring, climbing, and more. What's even better? Winter Wildlands Alliance members get 30% off everything on the site, and Mountain Training Center donates half of those sales back to Winter Wildlands each month. Join or renew your Winter Wildlands Alliance membership, then visit mountaintrainingscenter.com. It's training that supports your winter and protects it too. More info in the show notes.
So our last round of questions, I'd love to hear from each of you. For the folks representing tribes on the panel, the question is, what can recreation and conservation groups in Washington and across the country, so those of us in the room from NGOs, what can we do to address recreation impacts on tribal rights and wildlife? And particularly for the tribal representatives, what advice do you have for groups who are interested in working with tribes to address recreation impacts? And then, Joel, when we get to you, I'd love to hear any advice you have on how groups can encourage land managers in other states to do similar work that you're doing and help address recreation impacts on tribal rights and wildlife. So Ezekiel, let's start with you this time.
All right. So I think something that some of the NGOs can do to help with tribes is first approach the tribes and ask how they can get involved. One thing, I wonder if Sarah will touch on this, one thing we've experienced in the past is there's a lot of organizations that are eager to reach out to the tribe to try and help, but there is a burden on the tribe staff of capacity limitations on what we can and can't do. So sometimes even just asking, hey, how can we help? There's a lot of work on our end to do to answer that call. So come to the tribes with kind of an open platform to collaborate and work together to promote some education, but working to not place the burden of action on the tribe as the tribal government themselves. So I think that's the most important thing, to make sure that you're carrying your weight, and then promoting education to the public. And I think it's helpful to understand in the recreation community that these tribes have weathered all forms of extraction, from mining to logging, and what could now be considered a form of extraction, which is kind of the impacts of recreation on the landscape. And but reach out early, often, and make sure that you are able to carry your weight and not place a burden on the tribe with that support you're trying to help with.
So I was aware of a study that came out of the Nooksack area of Western Washington about recreation where there were bald eagle nests. And there was a lot of problems in that area with recreation impacts until they did some outreach to that community and let them know how those recreational uses were affecting the bald eagles during sensitive times of the year. And after that outreach, there was a big change in behavior and a much better result in that area. So I would just say to NGOs who are in touch and have a big megaphone with the recreational users out on the landscape, help bring awareness to the fact that while it may not seem like there are impacts, oftentimes, somebody who's practicing recreating responsibly, leave no trace, et cetera, that cumulatively, it's a numbers game in many places. We're just overwhelming nature. But to kind of bring, as Sarah was talking about, help us bring that shift in mindset to kind of away from a playground mentality and more to respect and recognition that these are complex ecosystems that many other non-human species depend on. Ultimately, we will depend on them as well, and that we all have to find some creative solutions because everybody loves the outdoors, me included, going hiking on Sunday to Slovenia. So I'm like taking my impacts out of the area, so nobody will see me on the trail. But so it's humbling, and I remind myself of that all the time. But am I willing to make changes to my behavior in order to preserve these complex ecosystems and share it with all of nature, and kind of away from that human-centric model? And ultimately, I think, recreation has a huge coolness factor, and the industry thrives on that coolness factor. If we can make it cool to recognize our own impacts, recognize the complexity of these ecosystems, and kind of mirror that when we are recreational users, knowing that being a responsible user may sometimes be not recreating there, if that is what's needed at a particular sensitive time of year, which you'll hear Joel talk about later. I think that ushering in that would be really helpful through your grassroots. Thank you.
Yeah, to build off what's been shared, I think in addition, to building partnerships, reaching out to tribes, and of course, acknowledging that capacity factor, the places you are either bringing volunteers to, you have programs, making sure your advocacy is place-based. So who are those nearby tribes? There are so many. And if they've already produced educational materials that are publicly available, that's for you to use and connect with their staff and get those acknowledgments and permissions. But that's work that has been done and can be uplifted by you as a part of your programming. And then building those relationships directly with staff can, create such creative and enriching solutions where, hopefully your programs, your volunteer programs, your different, if there's trail maintenance, that can build in, one, the education of the indigenous peoples of that land, but then two, how to build restoration in as a part of recreation. Because as Ezekiel mentioned, the impacts from recreation, both seasoned recreators and new recreators, it's extractive. It is a new type of extractive activity with the land. And we all have, the ability to build a reciprocal relationship where if we could also help restore lands as a part of recreation, then things are left better, actually, and we go beyond leave no trace. So is there an opportunity for, if you're really wanting to go out and be with the lands, looking for or even partnering with tribes to build those opportunities to, remove invasive species, planting native species, and really, again, restoration for who? Not just humans. And so thinking about that as well. And that's where the partnership with tribes can be really meaningful because they bring that perspective of time immemorial of, who's been on those lands, what's really important. And I'd say that's one thing. The Snoqualmie tribe, we host a volunteer program. We do restoration events in Snoqualmie Valley. Would love to see it grow, and as a part of recreation, having folks who are looking to visit this area or call this area home, just new and more opportunities to restore the lands for more than just humans as well.
I think I had a slightly different prompt. Can you remind me?
Yeah, of course. So advice you have for how groups could encourage land managers in other states to do similar things that you all are doing with STRI, and otherwise just encouraging land managers to address recreation impacts in their states.
Thank you. I agree with everything the other panelists said. And every place is different, and there are many different tribes. So don't want to overgeneralize with my response. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about how STRI came about and how it's been supported, particularly by advocates, and what has made it successful at this point. I think there's a lot of work yet to be done, and I think everyone on this panel will agree with that. But I do think that there's been sort of steady progress. So I want to talk about what that's looked like and how to support it. One thing that has been helpful is funding. And maybe that's saying the obvious, but part of how STRI formed, there was a bunch of advocacy from tribes over a period of several years with the governor's office, most pointedly, saying, we need a commission to address recreation impacts. This is a big problem. This is a problem. And unfortunately, the response was kind of slow. But eventually, there was a proviso that was funded through the legislature to support the work of state agencies to work with tribes on this particular problem. It was 2 years of funding. It started in 2023 and went through June 2025. And that funding was really sort of the tangible kickstart to this effort. That funding was for the state agencies, so that the proviso didn't provide funding support for tribes to participate, which is not great. What we did manage to do is secure a grant for, I think, $1 million with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to provide capacity pass-through funding to tribes to work with us. When I say us, I'm mostly referring to state agencies, on this initiative. And I think that's been pretty helpful. It helped to hire a consulting biologist, CBI, which stands for what? Conservation Biology Institute, thank you. And they work for the tribes. So capacity to do this is really important, which is kind of coming to even clearer into view because in this past legislative session, the state agencies coordinated requests into the legislature through the governor's office for more funding for this, for ongoing funding of some key positions like around ecological assessment, some of just the time that goes into this effort, as well as pass-through funding this time for the tribes. So there wouldn't have to be like a separate kind of grant-seeking effort to bring tribes to the table. And all that got into the governor's budget. None of it got through the legislative process and into the state budget. So we are operating right now with almost no funding for this effort. Thankfully, there's enough momentum, which is really born out of, I think, strong relationships, strengthened relationships, and deep commitment to this work. You know, for DFW, this feels just sort of mission-centric to be working with tribes in this way on addressing a problem that we all see. So there's that, but advocacy from groups like yourselves, which you probably have heard not just from me, but in support of public dollars to fund this kind of work is really essential. So there's that. A little bit on how STRI is structured, that's been successful too. I talked about the various levels of leadership. One thing that's been really important in our initiative has been good facilitation. One of the first decisions that the steering committee made was to hire the Whitener Group, which is a consulting group based in Washington. Bob Whitener is the owner, one of the owners and CEO, and he's been a facilitator. There's a very short list. I think he may be the list of people in Washington that both tribal participants and state agencies were like, we need that person. And thankfully, he agreed. And we've managed to keep some funding going to keep him working. His facilitation has been critical. I think another key to success has been creating a safe space to work in together. You know, we're drafting stuff, we're kind of coming up with ideas, we're putting things together, and it could be tempting as a public agency or as a tribal government to have your attorneys sort of perched on your left shoulder, like running everything through that kind of filter, which would really bog things down. So it's been a real benefit, I think, that there's this understanding, and this is something that our facilitator has encouraged, that this is a place where we can screw up, where we can make we can say some bad ideas, and we won't get skewered for it or sued. And that's I can't overstate how important that is. I think the other thing is grounding in science, and Libby can speak way more about this than I can because that's really where the technical work group is focused. grounding in science and traditional knowledge, and that's really directing our decision-making model, which is still very much a work in progress. But that orientation and having eyes on the prize that, it's been great that we've had a lot of progress around developing a charter and building relationship and better coordination, but all of us are committed to work on the ground. And the technical framework is really going to be essential for that. So making sure that when you're supporting an initiative like this, push for the inclusion of science and traditional knowledge. It's something I think that the state agencies and the tribes all are already grounded in, but being grounded in it together, I think, is really important.
Wonderful. Thank you all. That was amazing. Now we're going to open it up to audience questions.
My name is Mike Crosby. I am co-founder of Wintering Wildlife Conservation Initiative, which I would welcome all of you guys to go to the website, winteringwildlife.org. And I've got a few stickers still, but I'm from Colorado, where we're dealing with the same issue as is the rest of the world. And I think you guys can join up. It's free to join. We don't have any money, so it's all just passion driven. So just wanted to say that. And I'm afraid that the long-term solution is going to be pay-to-play type situation, permitting or something like that, because there's just too many humans out there with the same interests now that we have of the natural world. And I think the education format of teaching people that they're just part of the big picture of all the critters that are out there is very important. And it's missing in the recreation community, I'm sorry to say.
Thank you.
This is for Sarah. You talked about a program where you were enlisting visitors to do visitor use monitoring and data collection. Can you speak a little more about that? What tools do you use? How do you train people? What data are you collecting?
Yeah, that was through a partnership with Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, and specifically looked at the Middle Fork Snoqualmie trails. And the Forest Service, through our monthly meetings with them, kind of flagged some things that they definitely wanted to monitor last year during the summer as a part of the Middle Fork Snoqualmie Wild and Scenic River Management Plan. And so data collection and monitoring the area is a big goal of that plan. And, with the limited staff and resources, we partnered to do a public observation survey. We use Google Forms. Survey 123, because that area also has no cell phone service. Found that actually people preferred the Google form anyway and shared observations after they left their hike. But really collecting observations if people were having negative or positive interactions with dogs off leashes. Were there conflicts with wildlife? Were they able to find trash bins at those trailheads? And then, again, like I mentioned, what were you able to pack out your trash? Did you see trash, and what kind of prevented you from taking out other people's trash? Because these were all kind of impacts when they were out there, when Forest Service staff were out there, they saw, but wanting to hear more and understand which specific trailheads were seeing these types of impacts. Because they were kind of considering, all right, would there need to be a special order about dogs off leash because it's, causing some impacts to wildlife, water quality, etc. We did learn those dog poop bags were everywhere. It's the thing that people see left along trails, every trail. And so how, the solutions for that is something that we're all still talking about Forest Service staff with, but knowing that that's the problem versus like interactions with dogs off leash on those trails was super key in our conversations with the Forest Service. So that's kind of where it was our first pilot survey, and actually a staff now they're doing a study on some interpretive signage, what messaging will work in that area to help promote coexistence with wildlife. So we're eager to learn what they learned from their study there. But I think, that public observation piece being a part of the on-the-ground monitoring is something that we've seen willingness from the Forest Service. And our next campaign is going to be, providing gloves and reusable trash bags, because the biggest thing that prevented folks from taking out trash that wasn't theirs, it was gross and I didn't have gloves. And so if, we can provide supplies as a part of our volunteer program, just remove one barrier from that.
Thanks. Tom Uniacke from Washington Wild. And as for kind of developing concrete, kind of tactics that folks can potentially employ, I heard talk about there are certain times of the year that are sensitive to at least wildlife. Do you know if there's information, it would have to be place-based, where certain trails like Middle Fork Snoqualmie or areas where we know that there are certain times where certain recreational activities are probably going to have a greater impact? Or is that something that you're looking to develop, or does that already exist so that we could maybe share that information?
I'll start and then maybe hand it over. But yes, there are places, and that's a really good lead into the next panel, because we're going to be talking about some place-based strategies to protect wildlife, particularly during the winter. I think we could probably do a better job of sharing and promoting that information. We try to put it out there in various formats, but I think this is an area where advocate groups can really help. In Washington, there's a thing called the Recreate Responsibly Coalition, which is public land agencies, advocates, conservation groups, and other NGOs, which is for this purpose of sharing information about particular risks to these areas, as well as safety risks. So that kind of coalition around that work is really helpful to us as a land manager to get some of that information out there.
Actually, that just reminded me, after you heard Joel kind of describe what we're trying to do, the states and the tribes here, to address recreation impacts. I know a lot of you, I know we've drawn from Colorado, from Wyoming, Montana, but be really happy to hear from any of you that have seen this kind of work in action in your states, where it's led to some good results. So this is a great forum. I've already learned from a few people some of the things they're doing that I think could really benefit our work. So it's a work in progress.
I'll just add a little bit onto that real quick. There's mechanisms in place to kind of limit and restrict activity, say for logging, to protect wildlife during sensitive times of the year. But I'm not familiar with anything that exists for just general trail use in Western Washington that's implemented. One thing I will share is that a couple of years ago, the Snoqualmie Valley had an escaped zebra running through the valley. For those of you who are not aware of the lore of North Bend, in the county, we are able to shut down all recreation in that entire corridor to not disturb the zebra. And that's kind of, I was like, well, if we can do that, I think we might be able to create some buffers during breeding season for some of these things.
Yeah, hi, Lynn Paget. I'm from Erie County, Colorado. And I think what I'm taking away from your panel is that maybe we have a unique situation in Colorado where we have our expert state wildlife agency, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, working with federal lands to create timing limitations, to use an oil and gas term, for different types of recreation for different wildlife, especially for winter concentration areas. And so just a local story. We had a local group, chapter of Cabo, which is mountain biking, look to create a trail system that was accessible from a population town of about 1,000 people, so rideable to that area. And the ability to use that trail system ends on November 1st. It doesn't open again until May 1st, and that provides the buffer for winter for elk and deer. And the social policing of that has resulted in a 98% adherence rate. And so we don't have the federal lands or the state land managers having to do a heavy patrolling of that, because if somebody sees a picture of a mountain biker posted on Instagram, I mean, the community just swoops in. So yeah, it's a very unique background for those photos. But maybe you could educate me. How many states don't have a collaborative timing discussion going on between a state expert, wildlife agency, and the places where we recreate? Maybe I've taken that for granted.
Just to clarify the question. So are you asking if we have kind of timed entry for state lands, or is that, I think, and I heard sort of concern before about, there's going to be pay to play and permitting, but permitting and timed entry, we're starting to see it in the national parks in the state. We've had it in some of the more beautiful, like the Enchantments is a place in Washington that's hugely popular, and for a long time you had to get kind of special permits to get in there. So there is that. I think one thing that I'm hearing also, though, is coordination between the state and the feds. We do have a bit of that, especially in places where it's either checkerboarded or there's an adjacency of like one with the other. We do a lot of coordination. I love to hear about the social policing. I think we need more of that. We had and I'm going to talk about this in the next panel, so spoiler. But we do closures for mule deer, wintering mule deer in the Methow, which is in sort of the northeast corner of the state, excuse me. And it's relatively new, and we're calling it a pilot, and part of what we're looking to see is compliance, because we have camera traps out there looking both at the deer as well as people, and compliance was really great in the beginning, and then it kind of tapered off. So there needs to be sort of a culture shift that's facilitated, I think, by like a drumbeat of messaging, not just from government or tribes, but from other users, which I think would help a lot.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Trailbreak Radio Season 2. If this conversation resonated with you, this is a moment to stay engaged. Visit winterwildlands.org, subscribe to our emails, and follow us on social media to learn how Winter Wildlands Alliance inspires and empowers people to protect America's wild snowscapes.
Today's episode of Trailbreak Radio was hosted by Winter Wildlands Alliance Operations Manager Emily Scott and me, Policy Director Anneka Williams. It was edited by Adam Titmus.
And made possible by our panelists and our grassroots advocacy conference partners, Outdoor Alliance, REI Co-op, the Mountaineers, Duct Tape Then Beer and Dirtbag Diaries, High Country News, Phreem Family Brewers, and our host, University of Washington's Pack Forest.
Our theme music is by Rattlesnake Preachers, featuring Winter Wildlands Alliance's Snow School Director, Carrie McClay. Additional music by Blue Dot Sessions.
In our next episode, we'll continue this conversation with a panel focused on how to balance recreation with wildlife habitat. Thanks for listening and for carrying these perspectives with you into your favorite winter landscapes.